In our class earlier this week, we began on our second project, which is a portrait. I brought in several different examples or photo references for you to work from. In my demonstration, I showed you how to do a transfer drawing. I'm not going to demo that here because I've already done it. I'm actually just going to show you where to go from here. I'm going to paint the portrait that I'm doing as a demo. I'm not going to do much detail. I'm using this as a value study or an underpainting where I just block in lights and darks, just value. And then I will use that as a template for when I start to add skin tones next class. You can see the picture that I chose. I've already, as I did in class, did that transfer drawing onto the canvas. There are several reasons I mentioned for doing this. The one that I want to emphasize is that when you do a transfer drawing, you leave very little graphite or whatever, if you use transfer paper, very little material on the canvas when you do the drawing. There's just a very simple, faint line. That graphite, if there's a lot of it, will mix in with your colors as you paint, and it's kind of got a greenish hue to it. So if you were to draw directly onto your canvas and have a lot of mistakes or erasures and lines and just a lot of graphite on there, it would actually affect the color of your painting. If you would rather not use the photograph to trace from and you would rather just do a freehand drawing, or if you're working from a live model, I would still recommend doing your drawing on a separate piece of paper and then doing a transfer drawing of your drawing onto the canvas. Again, so you don't start with a bunch of graphite on your canvas that will eventually blend in or mix in with your colors and affect your palette. We're starting off with this, with a white canvas. I'm not doing any underpainting. I'm not doing a layer of or toning the canvas at all. So I'm actually going to need quite a bit of paint just to cover the surface area of this canvas. And I see too many of you just squeezing out a little, pea or quarter size worth of paint that would be impossible to use to cover this large of a canvas. And this isn't a very big canvas. This is like 8.5 by 11 or 9 by 12 or something like that. So I have a number of different sizes of brushes, right? I have at least one large one because I've got this background area that's a fairly monochromatic. There's a bit of a gradation, a little modulation in the value there in the background, but not very much. And there's just no reason to try to paint that large of an area, a surface area, with a brush this size, right? It's just going to be a lot more work a lot more strokes if I try to paint this whole background area, those large shapes, with a small brush. So choose a brush that's appropriate to the size of or area that you're addressing. And it really does save a lot of time and just a lot of work. And then I've got a range of other brushes here that I can use to address more or less detailed areas of work. None of them are very quality. You can see that I have not maintained them especially well. I tend to use these synthetic brushes for acrylic because they're a little bit less expensive, and I just plan on beating them up quite a bit. All right, the other thing that I have here that would be worth showing you is some matte medium, and this is a glass palette. I also have my two colors, white and burnt umber, on a shop towel. That's not a regular paper towel. It's a towel that's from like a auto supply store or hardware store. It's more rugged than a home or a kitchen paper towel. It won't start peeling off or getting mixed up in my paint. This will keep the paint wet for hours, days even, if you keep that paper towel wet, as opposed to if I were to squeeze the paint directly out onto my palette. That paint would start getting a layer of dry skin on it after 2 or 3 minutes, not much time at all. So squeezing your paint out on a wet paper towel can really save a lot of paint. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. I'm going to use a big brush and a lot of paint. With oil and acrylic, I'm going to work dark to light. I tend to, well, the general rule is err on the side of being too dark. You know, if it's going to be between being too dark or too light, you know, you're better off leaning on the darker side of things. You'll see that I'm putting down my brush before the line and then just kind of pushing into the line. That way I'm unloading the brush. I'm not going to get a ridge of paint around that outline of the portrait. Another advantage, or another reason why you want to use perhaps even more paint than you think you need, is because that extra paint on there will keep the paint wet for longer, which will allow you to blend. And in this case, in the background, I do want to add a little bit of variety. So as I go along here, I'm going to be grabbing or changing the tone here, the value of this brown that I'm using. And again, I'm only using burnt umber and white. The demo this upcoming week will be, I'll be talking about, you know, basic skin tones. And there's a reason I want to have you at this point where we've got you know, an understudy, a value study to work off of. All right, and on this side, you can see right there, hopefully you can see right there, that because that paint is wet, I can do a gradation. I can blend from this side into this darker value on the left side of the painting. I'm not too worried about having a crisp edge on that. I'm more concerned with getting an even gradation that doesn't look like, you know, it's an outline of the head. I want to make it look like it's a consistent background that goes behind the face, or the person here. All right, so I'm okay with that. I'm actually going to bring a little bit of a lighter value down here on this side of the face. I see that in the picture, and also having a little bit of light value is going to offset, be a nice point of contrast for this shadow side of the face. So I'm going to get this reversal where on this side, on the highlight side, the background is going to be darker than the skin tone. On the opposite side, on the shadow side of the face, the background is going to be lighter than the shadow side of the skin tone. So there's a nice reversal. You get that. Photographers use that a lot in portrait photography. So as you can see, that was a lot less work. Took me a lot less time to block that in than it would have if I were using a smaller brush. Oh, I forgot to do that. This little lighter spot that I was talking about. But hopefully you can see how much easier it is to blend, to keep the paint wet long enough to blend, and just to get enough paint down there when I'm using this larger brush. I would love to see more of you using larger brushes, especially at the beginning of a painting. Okay, so that I'm just gonna have a subtle shift into a lighter value there on this opposite side of the face, and hopefully that's enough contrast there that it will make a difference. All right, so now I'm going to start blocking in the basic highlights and shadows on the face. One thing that I want to mention here before I get into painting the face is generally you want to work, as a general rule, you want to work from general to specific. So that means I paint the biggest shape first. In this case, it's the negative space or the background. That helps to start to establish the context for the rest of the value relationships in the image, because remember, our perception of value and color and imagery is very relative. How light the highlight will look will depend on it having dark around it, as a point of contrast. So working big to small helps in that regard. It helps us to start establishing more of a context for the rest of the color or values in the painting. Another reason to start with the background first is that we tend to, once we start painting on a face, there's a psychological, thing that kicks in where we lock in on the face and we no longer are thinking as much of or much about the background. And we really need to avoid that for the sake of our painting. You need to remember that in painting and in drawing and image making in general, negative space is just as important to the success of an image as the positive space is. And if we allow ourselves to get too caught up in what the painting is of, meaning like the subject matter or the positive space, it really can affect the success of the overall composition. So that can have a positive effect when we start with the background first, and then finally just being able to not worry about messing up the sharp lines that are around the head in this case, because I know I can just paint back over the background where I kind of go over that line and sharpen those edges back up. As you're going along in your painting, what I would like you to be doing is just put a little dab of your paint down on the actual piece of paper and see how well you're matching that value. So in that case, that brown, I see very little contrast. I actually see a little bit of contrast, between my paint and the background, and the paint looks a bit darker. So, in this case, I'd want to lighten that value to match add a little white to match the value of the background. Also remember that the paint's going to dry a little bit darker than it is when it's wet. So for instance, this chin area, if I'm mixing up this value, just put a little touch of it right there, and I can see that it's too dark, so I'll add a little bit more. I'll lighten it up with a little bit of my titanium white, and then let's put a little bit of it on there. Still too dark, so I'm going to try going too far. I'm going to add a lot of titanium white and put a little dab of it on there. And you see that with each iteration of that color, I'm seeing less contrast, less dark and light contrast between my little swatch of paint and this reference image. And let's see if I can go even lighter. Let's see if I can go too light. If I go too far the other way, I should start seeing some contrast in the reverse direction, like the image is darker than my paint. And actually that's not even too far. If I were to put straight white on there, it would probably be too light, but in this case that's probably about right because it's going to dry again a little bit darker. To teach yourself to learn to start seeing that, it's helpful to actually put that paint directly on the paper and watch as that contrast disappears as you lighten or darken. As I'm painting, I will periodically just move to a different part of the painting rather than spending too much time in one area. So right now you can see that I've been primarily working on the face, but I still have obviously the eyes, nose, and mouth largely unpainted. I think just to keep myself in check and keep myself from getting too attached to any one part of the painting, I just have a habit. Like if I've been spending a lot of time in one area of the painting, no matter what it is, I try to keep myself moving around. So right now, instead of continuing on the face, even though I've got a lot of work there to do, and maybe I am a little bit anxious about keeping the paint wet enough, long enough to blend, I'm just going to move on and come back to that later and start working on the shirt a little bit. Right. I think I'm going to be done for the day, but it's far from finished. There's a lot I could do to refine the image, and some errors I could correct. But I think for the sake of this demonstration and what I'm trying to teach you with this project, this is enough. Just as a review, a couple of things. Use a brush the size appropriate for the area that you're trying to address. So if you're trying to address a large area like the background, use a big brush. It's easier to blend with, it's faster, it's not as much work. There are a lot of reasons why it's worthwhile using the right tool for the job. Next, working big to small, general to specific, helps to start establish those value relationships early on. Moving around your painting constantly rather than spending too much time developing one area more than another can help you from getting locked in and from not seeing problems as they arise, but also not having an inconsistency in the actual paint application across the surface. So if you find yourself spending a lot of time in one area, especially on the face, catch yourself and move to another part of the face or move to another part of the painting entirely, and that will help you avoid some problems and make a more cohesive image. So next class period we will be adding skin tones. We're going to use a limited palette and use this value understudy as a template when we start adding skin tones, a template for value. So we're going to match the value of the skin tone to the values that we've established here, and it makes it a little bit easier to maintain that modeling, that 3 dimension that happens with value contrast. So we'll see you in class.